Okay, so we are ready to begin. Welcome everyone. My name is Elaine Ikomako. I was brought on with the City Arts just a few months ago to help with the arts and culture recovery work, and I'll be your main contact. And as Jenny said, she is our recovery manager. So we're both here and we're really excited to do this webinar. So we're going to just go ahead and get started, and folks will be coming in. I'm sure we have a few more folks, and maybe they can just introduce themselves or we can just note that. But I want to first start with a land acknowledgement. We live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish people, the original stewards of the land, past and present. We honor them with gratitude for the land itself and to the Duwamish tribe. So thank you. Now, some of you today, we've worked with in other capacities. I know Jenny knows some of you, and I actually recognize a few folks from some of my other work, but others are new to this office, and we're just wanting to welcome all of you. Like I say, we're very, very enthusiastic and thrilled to do this program. You have been specifically invited to participate. And as noted in the email, we actually selected you to participate because we know about the good work you do and your track record. So as we go through these slides, we're going to explain a little bit more about what invitational means, what the process is, because it's going to be a little bit different than the usual competitive RFP processes. So here we go. A lot of the information in the webinar will be also things that were in the program guidelines, but I think it's really helpful to flesh out a little bit, and that's what this purpose of the webinar is for. So now we're going to go into the agenda. I will mention at the end here, you can see the bullets here, that there is going to be opportunity to ask your questions real time. And we're going to allow some time after each slide. You can either raise your hand, you can see where the icon is, or you can put it in the chat where both Jenny and I work as a team. So we'll be monitoring that and make sure your questions get answered in real time. So as you can see, we're right here on the agenda, and we're going to just move right through here. Overall, this is going to be a chance for you to get your questions answered. One thing I do want to mention is that some of you are participating, but you're not quite sure about, whether or not you're going to participate in this program, and that's fine. We're really happy that you're here to learn more. The guidelines first in the book, first bullet was sent out to you, as you know, in the email. So we're not going to cover every single thing in there, of course, but we're going to highlight some of the important things. Next, the application process is through an online portal called Flux, and some of you are familiar with it, some may not be, and Jenny's going to walk you through this, and I think it'll be very helpful. It's a pretty simple process. And then we'll look at, of course, all the different parts of the application as a lead organization, and then we'll cover what is going to be expected next and timeline. So that's kind of the approach. We'll give you a moment. If you don't have any questions, just jump right in. Otherwise, we'll just keep going to the next slide.
Okay. I think there is one question in there. Devin asked, the guidelines say that you had to be 501c3 and Ballard Alliance is 501c6. Do they still qualify? We did check. You would still qualify for that. Apologies for being restrictive on there. We were getting these relatively out relatively quickly. So if anyone else is in the same boat, we will make note of that.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, Devin, because I know you asked that question before, and I'm glad we're able to answer that and that you were able to join it. Okay, so the project guidelines, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this one-time funding because it came from the city of Seattle. And I'm going to highlight exactly what it says here, that the intention is to support neighborhood recovery. The selected lead and the subrecipients are neighborhood-based organizations to carry out inclusive and creative endeavors to further the neighborhoods and cities' pandemic recovery. And of course, we know that the recovery is ongoing. Now, the selected leads and subrecipients will support the city's vision of One Seattle. We all know that that's a vision that has been put out by the city, and it's going to be by promoting equity, safety, social cohesion, collaboration, and resiliency. So that is the one-time funding, but this can be very exciting because it could lead to some other sustainable things in the future, and that definitely would be our hope. Now, the leads are can be arts and culture organizations, as it says here, or community-based organizations that may not have arts and culture as your primary mission. And I know a number of you fit that category, but it is to support sub-recipients who are doing events and programming that both have public benefit, are arts and culture, of course, because it's the nature of the funding, and has been most impacted by the pandemic. And we will kind of elaborate a little bit more about that as well. I see some questions coming through. You are, as a lead organization, can request, and this is going to be a streamlined process, but the range that we thought to make sure that we can cover all the areas in the geographical and demographical areas that we want to cover would be like 50,000 or 75,000 or up to 100,000. And the funds to these subrecipients need to be dispersed and events taking place by September of next year. One thing that Jenny and I talked about is that these dollar amounts could be adjusted from what you may request. It could be adjusted up or down, depending again on who does end up applying. We want to make sure that we've covered geographical and, as I said, demographics, and also make sure that there's some priority neighborhoods that we know have been most severely impacted by the pandemic. We want to make sure those neighborhoods are included. And of course, because this is city dollars, we want to make sure that all the council districts are well covered. Jenny, are there any questions out there?
Yes, there are. We are seeing a question about by end of September 2023, does that mean by September 2023, does that mean by the end of September? So what we're really looking at is that most of the events should be of like the subrecipients or the arts and cultural events should take place by the end of August, essentially, and all funds dispersed by the end of September, and all of your final reporting and things like that would be in by the end of September. So there may be a little bit of flexibility around exactly what date that is, but basically the goal is that for any of the organizations who are serving as lead organizations, all of their funds would be dispersed and they would have returned all of the final reporting and things like that to our office by the end of September.
Jenny, would it be okay if I see that Sean has a question about the regranting, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the next couple slides.
Sure.
That'd be okay if we went ahead and
Yep.
did it. Okay. Anything else? Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next two slides. And the eligibility and the next one afterwards really talks about the big questions that people have about lead versus subrecipients. So we're going to cover that kind of together. But I think that it's pretty clear, those bullet points, pretty straightforward because this is city dollars. We've checked and made sure that all of you are nonprofit. Again, some might be 501c6. We'll talk more about the capacity question. We'll talk a lot more about that in a second. The COVID guidelines, those are always changing. So we want you to make sure that to stay on top of those changes because we have to meet those mandates and protocols. And I know you all are very familiar with needing to address that. Now for the capacity question, yes, there needs to be some capacity, of course, to manage. And Jenny and I have talked about this and know that while there is a requirement for ability to manage subrecipients, we don't want to make this really burdensome. And we know that every organization is different. I mean, there's different sizes, and all of you are different distinct organizations and sizes. And so we really want to be sensitive to what your situation might be, and it could be look different for different organizations in terms of how they carry out their process with the subrecipients. But I think for me, I just want to emphasize that as long as it meets the requirements of full transparency, full accessibility to almost all the sectors of the neighborhood that we're looking at, especially in I, for those who are most impacted by the pandemic in your neighborhood. And again, we don't expect this to really be heavily burdensome on your organization. We'll talk more about that, but let's go to the next slide. And you can stop me if there's some questions that come up that I need to.
I'm seeing them. Sorry about that.
Okay. So funding, and we'll spend more time here on this, what it can be used for and what it can't be used for. And again, it was determined by the source of the funding and the text for that provision of funding. So neighborhood and arts organizations, but not limited to, because we have mentioned that some of you are indeed a broader mission than just arts and culture. But definitely the events need to be arts and culture in nature. And this is a city policy, the direct administrative costs up to 15% of the dollars that you are allocated. Now, funding that it can't be used for the lead organizations, and in this case, we're talking to you as potential lead organizations. Your primary work cannot be done outside of Seattle for the obvious reasons. The cost can't exceed 15%. Now, in terms of the indirect costs, we will have, it's not allowable because indirect costs, could exceed the 15%, but we do want to acknowledge that, and I've run nonprofits, so I know that there are indirect costs to do anything and everything. So in the budget sheet, we will have a place for you to talk about or to include potential indirect costs. Even though they're not covered, it might be very helpful for us to know what are the costs that you are engaging in. Let's see, and then the other no-nos for the subrecipients are pretty straightforward. Events can't be held outside of the city because this is city dollars. They need to be accessible to the public, and to my mind, that would be, accessible by public transportation, accessible by walking to, or bicycling, or, for the differently abled, we can't have, events that people can't access, and I think that's pretty obvious. Capital improvements or purchase of equipment. Also travel. We want to emphasize that this is local dollars for local organizations. So travel is not something that we would allow. And then of course, religious events and programming in which the fundraising is the primary purpose. So I think at that point, if there are other questions, I know that there have been questions about lead organizations and the disbursement. Go ahead.
There is a question around there was a question around sub-granting. Let me see. So one question was, lead organizations only re-grant the funds. Do they put on any activities? And there's a similar kind of question that overlaps with from Katie. If the organization is the main grantee is not an arts and culture organization, but hosts large arts and culture events, can we use some of the funding as the main grantee, or do we have to disperse it all to the sub-grantees?
Mm-hmm.
Elaine, do you want to answer that, or shall I?
Agreement was that?
I'll take on to you, Jenny.
Okay.
Okay, great.
So this funding was legislated by council, and it does name that lead organizations need to basically work with neighborhood arts or neighborhood organizations. I'm sorry, does somebody have their microphone on? I'm just getting a lot of feedback. Okay, thank you. So the legislation basically says that these funds need to go to a lead organization who works with neighborhood organizations who can apply for this funding to put on arts and cultural events. It does limit it to the funding being, the subrecipients do need to be like some type of organization, whether that's a business, nonprofit, or for-profit, say business. There are some ways where, and there needs to be some kind of application process involved. It doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't legislate that there has to be a very complex RFP process. you know, you could have these funds for you could have a rolling deadline if you wanted, and basically disperse the funds out that way. For lead organizations who do their own programming, these funds do need to go out through an application process. So the legislation again doesn't necessarily say that the lead organization can keep the funds for their own programming. It needs to work with other neighborhood organizations who can apply for that funding. However, if you have your own programming and your own programming has application and processes involved with it, so say you're putting on a festival and part of the way that you do the festival is by having, say, arts groups or organizations apply to be a part of the festival, then I believe that would count as some of the application process. If you serve for a fiscal sponsor for the other groups, again, I think you would need some kind of application process. And again, just to make sure that it's equitable. So you may want to address how you're making sure that you're funding. If you are also serving as a fiscal sponsor for organizations, how are you addressing to make sure that not just the groups that you fiscally sponsor, but that all neighborhood, you know, any other organizations that are in the neighborhood that you serve are also have access to these funds to put on arts and cultural events in the neighborhood or neighborhoods that you serve.
Yeah, I think Beacon Arts, I don't know that Betty Jean got on the call, but this was a big issue for that organization because they're an umbrella organization and they have a lot of programming, but the programming funds are restricted and they have an independent steering committee for every one of their programs. So in some way, I think what Jenny's saying is that there could be some way that those programs, you know, could, if there was some kind of, you know, application process, that we could work with that. I guess that's what it is, something that we'd like to really explore.
I hope that answers folks' questions. So you can kind of think a little creatively. Again, the legislation does say that folks have, and it's you can see the exact legislation in the guidelines. So it does say that groups have to work with neighborhood organizations to apply for those funds to put on arts and cultural events. So again, if you are the producer of the event, if you are a producer yourself of an event, I would probably think about, is there a way that you could disperse those funds through an application process to support the event itself, to go towards arts organizations. And again, when it goes to arts, unfortunately, it doesn't name individual artists as direct recipients of these. So again, if you're working with organizations who are working with individual artists, that's another way to support individual artists for it. If your event, you know, direct selects some entities of the event or programming that you do, but there are other areas where you do an application process. And again, I leave that kind of application as where we intentionally left it open, so that you can help define what is equitable and accessible for your community. You could figure out a way like X number of dollars we'd like to put towards our events that will go through an application process to support neighborhood organizations who will participate in the 3 events we do in the year, and the other portion will disperse through, you know, more open grant process or something like that for other events not associated with the events that you produce. So again, thinking a little creatively about how you can support how you might be, because we know that a lot of you also do programming. So how
Right.
is there a way that you can continue to like support the organizations, get them involved in the group, in the work that you're doing, but also support the work that other organizations in your neighborhood are doing? As far as when will funds be dispersed, we'll talk a little bit more about timeline for that. So at the end.
So, you know, along with what Jenny's saying, because again, we're really trying to work with you and trying to as this is evolving together, because this is, new dollars. And, so for example, as, kind of as Jenny, you're describing, to be creative. I mean, when we say an application process or some process for distribution of funds, those could look very different depending on the organization. And I would say, for example, if there was one of you do events, but you're partnering with, as Jenny's saying, partnering with some other neighborhood organizations, um, that's great. As long as there's some kind of process for applying to do those events. I think we're just trying to really work with what we've got to work with, and make this work, because I think this could be a very exciting program. Let's see
And
here, Devin.
Devin, your question about, yes, so basically what you've shared, which is you typically work directly with individual artists. Unfortunately, the legislation again clearly outlines neighborhood orgs. So if you were if you had a call open for all the activations in your neighborhood that you wanted to do, and Urban Artworks happened to be one of the applicants to apply to access these funds through you, then yes, they could then work with dispersing those funds to individual artists. So again, it has to be through an application process as legislated through council, but if Urban Artworks went through that application process to access those funds, however you name that application process, then they could work with individual artists at that point to do those events, if it's live mural painting or something like that.
I think just reading between the lines, one of the intentions in my mind, the way it was written, is just to not make it overly onerous in terms of RFPs or application, but to make sure that, it's equitable, that there is an open process, that we've allowed, all different or types of groups of all different sizes to access the, the process. So, being open, and just allowing a broad participation, even if it's just a matter of some way that works for you to announce it, so that, more than just the usual organizations that you're in touch with apply. But I think that point about going through an organization and reaching out to individual artists, I think that's great.
Any other questions before we move on?
Okay, so I think looking at the criteria here, now again, this is for the lead organizations. And one of the things to note here is that if you look at the 4 criteria, these are criteria that are pretty standard, or I guess, they're not surprising, I guess, in terms of, when you apply for funds. And the one thing to just note is that if you have the information already, like let's say, for example, criteria 1, pretty straightforward, strength of organization and relationship to the neighborhood and community. If you have direct established or relationships already to the entities and the practitioners in the community, that you should have at least some knowledge, if not relationships. And I think that's what we're getting at with this criteria. And again, if you already have those established, or you actually have some links that you could share with us to answer this, or maybe you already have it somewhere else in some other kinds of proposals, just tailor it in and use the information that you already have here. And the thing about the relationships is, for me, the way I see it is that, yes, most organizations have established relationships, which is great. You have good connections with others in the neighborhood, but we also want you to reach out to other new connections. And some neighborhoods are quite large and quite diverse. So we just want to make sure that you keep that in mind when you're looking at relationships and the strength of the organization. So again, not to expect a whole lot of new work, rewriting things if you have it already there. Criteria 2, community impact and recovery. Again, now this one is probably a little more specific in developing something, unless you've already applied for some other recovery dollars. What is your plan? envision for how these funds are going to really make a direct impact in the neighborhood, particularly those impacted by COVID. So, do you already have a knowledge and vision of that? Do you need to go out maybe into some of the neighborhood groups and connect with them and say what would most impact them to get back recovery um, out into the community and do some programming? So again, that would be your, it is really tailored to your situation. Criteria 3, inclusion and equity. So here, as you know, the city has a very strong embracing of anti-racism and the social justice initiatives on all the departments and all levels. And again, you're not probably unfamiliar with this question to make us understand and make sure that we know it's not a judgment, because everyone is at a different point in their path to be fully anti-racist and inclusive in all aspects. So we just want to make sure that we acknowledge where you're at and where we're trying to go in a very purposeful way. Reflects racial diversity, cultural, geographic, economic, disability, physical, LGBTQIAI, organizations. I mean, there's a lot of kind of what we call intersectionality. There's a lot of different aspects to diversity. So we just want to make sure that we can capture all of that. Fourth, organizational capacity, selection, and administration. Again, you probably have this information somewhere. You can submit links or you can just reprint and upload. We just want to make sure that the panelists who are reviewing these applications, can really vouch that you have the ability to manage this work.
We had a couple of questions in there, and I just want to, before we hop to the next slide, Kate had a question of, is there a desire to serve as many neighborhood organizations as possible, or is it okay to give larger distribution to fewer organizations? What I will say with this is there is a point of the application where we do ask for your budget, for a budget. Each neighborhood is different, and we're leaning on you to be the experts in those neighborhoods to know how best to disperse those funds. Again, given the limitations and intention of this. So it could be that if when you are looking at perhaps larger distributions, but the idea behind it might actually serve many many individual artists or many other kinds of organizations. I think for some of you, if you have like weekly or monthly events, perhaps you are looking to give an organization to curate all of those, to give individual artists, highlight individual artists to play out during an art walk or something along those lines. And perhaps that organization, again, we want to make sure that we're also supporting individual artists, even though these funds name that neighborhood organizations are the ones who can kind of apply as the subrecipients for it. So again, you could think of like one organization applying to be the curator for a monthly series of to put artists or arts activities happening during your art walks or something like that. So again, you all know best and hopefully are connected with others in your community to know how best to disperse these funds. It might make more sense to say we have, we want to give out $5,000 as opposed to $10,000 grants. We want to give out $2,000 grants, and we're just going to do it on a rolling basis, and organizations can apply until the money is gone and just do small and large events throughout the whole thing. So again, it's a little bit leaning on you to know what works best for how your community puts on events. The other, thank you, Sean, for your comment around the barrier for individual, for only arts organizations as being there. And thank you for naming that. If there is a way that you can kind of envision this, again, we've shared the legislation that made this funding possible. And again, the intention is there to put the hands in community to disperse these funds. If there is a way that, again, we're not necessarily just looking at arts organizations, the legislation named neighborhood organizations. And organizations could be individual, it could be, nonprofit or for-profit organizations. So if they, you may look at like sole proprietorships or individual, LLC, if there are artists or groups that have LLCs or other kinds of businesses, that could be, your guidelines may look at that as being a business that is like putting on an event as such. So again, if you have questions or if you have ways of thinking around some of the legislation to make sure that you're able to support your community and the events taking place in those communities, please feel free to reach out. And we're really trying to work with the organizations to make sure that it can be accessible to the communities that you're working with.
Yeah, we really want you to continue to explore how this can work. So, for example, in the Indigenous community, for example, I mean, in other communities too, there are really a lot of groups, like you're saying, that are just doing incredible work, and they may not be established as an organization. But I think what we're saying is that, perhaps they can come together and work under one another, kind of umbrella setup where they can still participate and be paid for doing this. So we're really wanting to figure out how to be creative. So if you have in the future any questions, and I know there's a lot of people on here, not on the call, that may have the same kind of question, and we really want to keep you engaged so we can help you through that and maybe help work through and brainstorm. Okay, I don't have anything else on that one. Yeah.
Great. So I'll be going through how to apply for this funding. We do have our new citywide system, or it's at least a year in the making. The way that you'll access this, so I have some slides that will show you, that we'll share with you afterwards, but I'm just going to actually go into the system and show you in real time what it'll look like or what your experience will be. The first thing that you're going to do, the link to the system, our Flux system, is on this slide here. You can click into that. Also, additionally, you'll be able to Elaine will work with you to help make sure that you have access to the application in the system as well. So just to give you a quick heads up, the very first thing, if you are interested in moving forward with an application, again, as Elaine mentioned, this is kind of an invitational, so we don't have an open application button. You can look at it in, you can find the link to our Flex system on the guidelines, but you'll just need to reach out to Elaine to let her know that your organization does want to move forward with an application. And what she'll do is she'll immediately set you up with an application. To do that, however, you will need to have a Flux account, and that is an individual account. So basically, I create an account for myself, and if your organization is already in the system, we'll be able to start an application right away for you. If your organization if you have an account in the system, but your organization is not already in the system, then Elaine may need to talk to you or get some information from you to just link your organization. For the most part, I think we have most of the information that we need, but she may need to follow up. And once we hear from there, we'll start an application for you, and it'll basically appear in your pending requests in the application section. So just to give you a quick, I'm just going to backtrack so it's easy for me to get into there. And I think I need to stop sharing my screen so that you can actually see and reshare it. So one moment. Okay.
I want to welcome Robert from Onyx. You came in late, Robert, and we're recording this, so no worries if you haven't caught it all, but welcome.
Okay. I should be sharing my screen right now, hopefully. So for those of you who who don't already have a Flux account, you can just go into this right here. It says create a new account. You'll just click on that. It's fairly easy. You just need your email address and name, and it will then send you kind of a verification to go in there. And you can then reach out to Elaine, and she'll make sure that your name is linked up to your organization and start an account for you or start an application for you right away. the way that, so, and then once all of that happens, all you have to do is log into your account in Flux. Once you set up your username and password, you will not need to navigate to this screen. Unfortunately, I have many profiles in the system because I work in it a lot. It will automatically, as a grantee, it will automatically take you to this screen. You'll want to make sure that if you are linked to multiple organizations, you'll want to make sure that you are either selecting all up in this upper left-hand corner, or you can potentially look for the specific organization that you are linked to. In this case, I'm just going to do all right away. And on the left-hand navigation screen, to find your application once Elaine gets you started, you'll scroll down to applications and pending requests. In the pending request, she'll follow up with an email, or if you're in a phone call with her and she's just starting up, she can start an application with you in a phone call as well. And what you'll do is she'll just give you the ID, or what you can look at is anything that has this little orange pill shape that says ARTS:NR, that's the Neighborhood Recovery Fund, or the ID will start as ARTS:NR, and that'll show you as the Recovery Fund there. And you'll just click on that application to get you started. The application will then appear to the right of your screen right here. And as you can see, you can scroll through just to see what's on there, or you can click the edit button to start filling it out. Most of what Elaine went, and once you click on the edit, you'll see that all of the applications are, all the fields are then available to start filling out. Some of the fields may appear to already be filled out for you, because again, once Elaine starts the application for you, some of those fields will automatically appear or fill in based on your information. You'll just want to make sure that your primary contact and authorized signer are correct when she sets that. If your address, make sure your address and tax ID number is correct, and go through make sure that these are all filled out, any information about your organization. Most of this is fairly self-explanatory and fairly quick. So website, primary, fairly quick. I think I saw a question just pop up. Are you filling this out and it disappeared quickly?
Are we filling out the foot for each program we are working on, or a total that we hope to disperse?
The total that you hope to disperse. So you're filling this application out with like your lead organization hat in mind. So if you don't necessarily have to fill it out on behalf of each program that you're looking to support, you'll be able to kind of address that in the application itself. So a lot of these questions, like I said, are fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to scroll to where the main questions speaking to the criteria section are. So organization background, these questions include the mission and purpose, the history of the work in the neighborhoods or neighborhoods, the multiple that you serve, and then any types of arts or cultural programs that you sponsored pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, or anything like that. The reason why you were invited is we had some idea of the work that you've already been doing. We're hoping that most of these questions are not necessarily questions that you need to fill out specifically for this application. Oftentimes you'll have already filled this, maybe this already appears on your website. Maybe there's somewhere else that you've been able to. So we strongly encourage you to repurpose any of the work that any written material that you already have accessible to you, to please use that already. It can be in list, it could be in list format. So if you're talking about the history of the work of the neighborhoods that you serve, or a history of the kind of programming that you've done during the pandemic, you could copy and paste that from your website. It could be in list form, it could be a narrative. Just please share the information. It doesn't necessarily need to be complex thesis statements, that sort of thing.
Sean said he had a question about the neighborhood part. Did you want to speak to it, or did you want to put it in the chat, Sean?
I will speak to it. Thank you. Yeah, I had just for our community specifically, like the Native community in Seattle, like there isn't one neighborhood that we all live in. So it's like it's hard for us. I mean, I can just put something down for just the sake of putting it down, but like it's very difficult to say, oh, I just work in, you know, Beacon Hill because that's where everyone is, or I work in South Seattle. Like that's not something that fits for our community. So how would you suggest that we answer that?
I would say speak to the community that you serve, and maybe you could explicitly say what you've shared already.
Okay.
I would just say, you know, because of the because of the way that the community has been impacted, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because of the history, um,
Okay.
that that you don't necessarily, or your programs may not necessarily take place in specific neighborhoods, and that the communities that you're looking to serve are within Indigenous, and perhaps any efforts that you might do to partner um, within neighborhoods necessarily, you know, when, you know, if you are doing, if there is an arts or cultural event that would take place, or if you are looking at kind of geographic community, certainly feel free to mention that. But I think what you
Mm-hmm.
just shared with us would be a great thing, and we would definitely take that into consideration.
Okay. Thank you.
Um, Again, you can look at that as any other kind of community, geographic community or cultural community as well. These three questions, like I said, hopefully these are things that you already have available on your website or in past programming or other kinds of places that hopefully you can lift from. We will not penalize you from copying and pasting if you need to. So we're trying to keep this low barrier just to get this information quickly here. This where it's program information, this is going to be a little bit more about how you're distributing those funds. So to the question that was asked earlier, are you filling this out for multiple programs, or are you just filling this out once and speaking to the program, you know, speaking to how you're distributing those funds? This is where you kind of speak to your role as a lead organization in a neighborhood or a community. So here we're looking at community impact, and all of these are basically speaking to the specific criteria that Elaine spoke to earlier today. So community impact, share your proposed plan for distribution of funding within your community. So again, this is the overall plan. You don't have to talk about a specific one. So as we said, if there is programming that you do that goes through an application process, perhaps you're looking at, you know, supporting that because you know that you're meeting a lot of the supporting a lot of community that has been heavily impacted through your own programming, but that you will also set aside funds to distribute for, you know, outside, you know, for events not necessarily that's your programming or outside produced. The equity inclusion, speaking to this is very similar to the criteria that Elaine spoke to earlier today. How are you ensuring equity inclusion in your funding decisions? So that could either the distribution of the funding or in the decisions themselves. Are you including community in the decision making? Is the design of how you're distributing those funds meeting any of those needs to make sure that it's accessible and inclusive? And then just speaking to your organizational and administrative capacity to support these funds. So again, if you've done a program similar to this and you're looking to just bolster the program that you already have, you may want to, you know, if you've done a program that's similar that only funds individual artists, but now you want to expand and put these funds to help support arts and cultural organizations, you could look at putting it that way and kind of speaking to what you're already doing. You could use that as an example as well. So again, we're hoping not to we recognize that this is somewhat of a fast turnaround for these funds, and this opportunity arose relatively quickly. So we're hoping that you can pull together stuff that you already have, or at least outlining the capacity that you have. And then a high level timeline of what your key dates are for distributing the funds and supporting these projects. So again, it can be a list of events or a list of key dates. It does not need to be a complex narrative. You can even, at the end of our PowerPoint, you'll see that we have our own timeline here. If you want to use that and kind of adjust it to what works for you or give a little bit more specificity, you can use that as kind of an example of what you might use for the timeline in this section. The Last
Jenny?
major, yes?
Oh, before we go into the budget,
Mhm.
Devin actually has a good question. And, if you have questions that you think maybe was covered, please put in the questions because there's going to be a lot of people not on this that will benefit from your question. So Devin's question was, does the sub-grantee need to have a Seattle address? Does the sub-grantee need to be from our exact neighborhood? Which is a really good question.
Yeah. I don't, so the neighborhood art, I keep on saying neighborhood arts organizations, and we used to it, but neighborhood organizations to apply for those funds. I think you could probably make a case for, well, I'll give you an example of how Seattle has worked. I think they probably need to have some basis in your neighborhood, and that's really the intention of these funds, that the kind of supporting the local arts and cultural organizations that support your neighborhood. However, our funds are limited to supporting those who live, work, and reside or visit the city of Seattle. However, we know that because of gentrification and rising housing costs, that it's difficult to, if we are looking at meeting our racial equity, our commitment to racial equity, that if we only fund those who actually have Seattle addresses, that it will exclude a large number of the population, especially who have been most impacted by COVID in these. So I think maybe when you're looking at it, when you're talking about neighborhood organizations, you might be able to think, so we've actually transitioned to saying Seattle based and not necessarily using mailing address as a sign of whether they are a Seattle based organization, knowing that many folks can't afford living in a group, but they may contribute very strongly to a community within Seattle. So I think if you kind of use that as, I think that was a question from Devin. So if you think of like Ballard based, does that mean like they spend a bit of, do they have some connection to the community and know what the community within Ballard
Yeah,
would
Jenny,
benefit
thank
from?
you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, if I may further clarify, if we are, obviously, if we become a grantee, and we have to, in order to disperse the funding to a sub-grantee, need to put out an RFQ, and let's say the best applicant isn't actually from our neighborhood. They're from SoDo, for example, or something like that. Would that denigrate our application because we wouldn't necessarily be hiring an organization from the actual neighborhood of Ballard, even if it directly benefits the Ballard neighborhood through what is ultimately created for the Ballard neighborhood?
I'd like to say like you're working with neighborhood organizations and hopefully they're working with groups that would benefit the organization. And I think you can make a claim that those are still like neighborhood organizations to support the work that you as the neighborhood are doing collectively. So I think there is a little bit of flexibility around that. Unfortunately, the legislation clearly states that organizations have to, that the subrecipients essentially need to be organizations. So I think if you were looking at that and you're working with other neighborhood organizations to say, as part of the panel process, and you've all decided that, or other artists or residents or things like that, and you've all decided that that's an organization that you want to work with to put on events or cultural happenings in there, that I think, again, you may want to work with them to make sure that they're also hiring Ballard artists who live in the area and bring it back to kind of local support as well.
Okay,
So
thank
Jenny,
you.
so Bailey, just back to the neighborhood based, I think what you're saying is that they, as long as the work in the organization is, Seattle based, that the events and whatnot are going to be held in Seattle, they don't necessarily have to have a per se Seattle address. Is that what we're understanding? That was a question by Bailey. Then Seth has a different question, and then So let's try to take that one first, the neighborhood, the Seattle address versus being Seattle based.
Sorry, I'm having a, let me just check where.
Bailey's, let's take Bailey's first because that has to do with what you had already just talked about.
No orgs need to be in or, yeah, I think more Seattle based. It's hard to say that. I will say that neighborhood boundaries are always a little squishy. So I think as long as they're Seattle based and that it is keeping it somewhat local, I think you'll be okay with that. But again, I think you want to make sure that you are looking at this in a way that benefits your neighborhood. And if you can make sure that you articulate that in whatever application process that you put forth.
Mhm.
You know, you all are the experts of what your neighborhood needs, or at least know you're the experts of who to go to in figuring out what your neighborhood and or community needs.
Bailey, does that answer your question before we go on to the other questions? Just want to make sure we're covering. Okay. So before we go to Seth's question, which is kind of different, which is a good question, Kate is asking from the Friends of Waterfront, similarly, you know, can they partner with neighborhood organizations from all over the city, many from neighborhoods and communities highly impacted by COVID, which is great, but may not be from the downtown area waterfront specifically. Just to clarify, it's okay that sub-recipients be from other Seattle neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think if you can focus on kind of the Seattle based and again articulate how that is supporting the, you know, supporting your neighborhood or neighborhoods or community or cultural community that you are working, I think you'll be fine.
Okay. And then Seth, let's go back up to Seth's question, which is good. Okay. For
I
the
think both of
event
those.
element, yeah. Can there be a preference for discrete calendar events, you know, one-off events, or can it be rolling periodic activations? I think, Jenny, you had talked a little bit about.
Yeah, so I think again, you all are, you know, we're reaching out to you to partner with you and give, you know, hopefully give these funds to you to help disperse in your neighborhood and work with other stakeholders in your neighborhood to address what works best for your neighborhood. So it could be, you know, you could make a plan for supporting very specific calendared events, or you could be looking at cultural events that are rolling or periodic activations or some combination of those. So however you design your own application process should support cultural events that support your, you know, the needs of your neighborhood. Some neighborhoods might have huge, you know, a few huge events throughout the year, and that's really what serves them. And others, maybe it's more, like you said, rolling activations or smaller activations that happen on a weekly basis. Again, kind of giving that example of perhaps you're working with an organization to curate curate musicians to play, you know, in front of storefronts or something like that all throughout the summer or throughout the winter as folks are doing like holiday shopping or something like that to help support the businesses in your neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Okay, don't see any other questions on this.
We are coming up against time. So what I'd love to do is I will try and do the let me finish up this application. I'll stick and then I'll table any other kinds of questions until we can finish up this presentation. If the folks stick around, I'll be able to answer those. The applications real quickly, I believe, are due September 29th for this. So the one thing that I want to mention, we're at the budget stage for this. So you can, for this particular, you can do 50,000, 70, you can request 50,000, 75,000 or 100,000 in funding. You may not receive the exact amount that you are requesting. We cannot guarantee that everybody will be funded, but I will say that our intention is to fund as many of the organizations that have been invited in a way to support equitably across the city. And so that may mean that we'd like to see how much you kind of self-select into, or how much you think that you could distribute or that feels right to you to distribute. And then we may work with, depending on, we'll use the score to then see how much, how that funding is shared amongst. So again, our intention is to fund as many groups as possible. We cannot guarantee that everybody will be funded, but it's not, we're also hoping to not make this a competitive process, of only funding a few organizations. So really our intention is to get as much funding to those organizations that have been invited to apply as we possibly can. As far as the budget goes, what you'll do is you'll just download there is a budget template. So you can click on this little template right here. It will open up a Excel document. You're welcome and download that to your website. You could, or download to your app, to your computer, pardon me. You can fill this out. There are instructions for how to fill it out. There is a blank budget. And if you go over to the next little sheet on the budget, there is a sample budget that you can take a look at as well. So you can break that down a little bit more. You'll just save that budget as is, and then you'll go back to your application and click on the little plus screen or green plus sign, pardon me. And sorry, I have my chat box all blocking the way. And then it just asks you to add a file. And once you filled that out and saved it, you'll just add the file as you are right there. The last item is just organization demographic information. So we are asking for you to kind of fill out this section around your programming services and leadership. If you don't have exact numbers around kind of the makeup of your organization, or best estimates are helpful as well, and that is fairly self-explanatory. And that's pretty much the end of the application. Once you're done with your application, you'll hit save and close. And it will save all of that. It doesn't not automatically save. So you'll notice in the application that there's interspersed reminders to save and continue your application, just to hold on to all of your things. And once you're done and ready to submit, you can hit submit application and it will submit. If there are pieces or elements missing from your application, it will come up with a little red or a large red one. In this case, I didn't fill out a whole lot, and you can just click on this and it will jump to the error message that of any of the required fields that were left blank, and it'll kind of walk you through that and save it. And then you can hit save and close again, and then finally submit. So I will jump back over to let me just stop sharing my screen so I can get back to where our PowerPoint is, and we can kind of finish the remainder of this. So I'm going to scroll through a lot of these slides because it kind of shows you what I just did in real time, but it just gives you an outline of what the pieces of the application are, which we spoke about already. So here's the budget, and just in case you need a reminder, we'll be sharing this PowerPoint slide out just so that you have this in case you don't want to go back and watch the whole video from start to finish to find those sections. And then finally, you'll save and submit. The last item is the timeline. So I think, am I successfully sharing my screen again? It's giving me a little bit of, okay, great. So I'll toss it over to you, Elaine.
Okay, yeah, so just one thing, when Jenny showed that budget template, that was included early on in the first email we sent, but that's also going to be available on Flux, and you can also use that. Very straightforward, very simple. You've all done budgets before, and this one's really simple. And then otherwise, you can also submit your own budget as well. There are people that are leaving, which is fine. We're going to have this recorded. Thank you, Muget, for coming, and Katie. The timeline real quickly is straightforward. You've asked about that. So right now, you have been invited as leads, and those who are going to be listening to this recording later, because they were also invited. So that is a close timeline, as Jenny has said, because the applications on influx will be due on the 29th. I'll work with you very closely, so no worries if there was something that you missed so far in the flux overview that Jenny just did. Mid-October, we have a really compressed, small selected review panel that will be quite representative, but they'll meet, review, and make the funding recommendations. Early November, you'll be notified and contracted with. Then starting in winter, you can start carrying out the process to select your subrecipients. And, as we noted earlier, we might review applications kind of before the deadline even. You might already start thinking about who you're going to be, starting to work with in the process for sure before that. But again, the decision's not made until, the timeline we've laid out. January or winter through August, as Jenny said, we're looking at toward the end of August to have all your events completed, and then September 2023 for the reporting. Okay, I don't have anything else about the timeline.
And again, so the August 2023 is a little squishy. So basically, we just need most of the events to have taken place, so that it leaves you with time to submit your final reports and any final payment requests that you would make to us to help it invoice for that. So we just want to make sure that you all have enough to kind of finish up close out your books to then share them back to share back the reporting with us. We do need to close it out by September at that point.
And one thing for me is to know pretty quickly now, I know a number of people have left, but I'll follow up with them. But, we do want to know as soon as possible if you are interested, because then we can kind of get the process going. And if you're not, then, we have some other options that we have to pursue at that point too. So timeline's pretty tight here, just in terms of knowing the interest level. Okay. Out of curiosity, how is this funding stream different from the program administered by DON? I'm not Jenny.
Are you referring to like Department of Neighborhoods, their community matching fund? Was that from Kate?
Yes.
Is Kate still around?
Yeah, she said the funds that support the neighborhood events.
Yeah, sorry, looking for the mute button. There's a Department of Neighborhood Grants program that supports, neighborhood cultural events. I was just wondering how this funding stream is different than that one. I don't remember the exact name of it.
Sure. So Department of Neighborhoods has a matching fund, and you all should definitely look at that if you haven't applied and you need funding for other things. So this is slightly different. This is one-time funding that was council legislated to help with mitigate the effects of the pandemic and help support with recovery within neighborhoods. So when you're asking about funding stream, it is a one-time kind of infusion of funding into neighborhoods or communities to help support with additional activation. This one, for the neighborhood one, if you have programming, you would apply to Department of Neighborhood specifically for that project, for that community-based project. This funding is different in that, how shall I say, this funding is slightly different in that we are looking for anchor or lead organizations to be the sub grant these within their own organizations, or within their own neighborhoods. So it does give a little bit more of the agency within those neighborhoods, or to you as organizations, to help disperse those funds in a way that you see fits your neighborhood. The Department of Neighborhoods funding, those can support similar projects, and you could look to apply for them. But again, you're applying directly for those funds to support that project. And instead, these funds are meant to partner with neighborhood organizations or community organizations to help disperse those funds. So, you're the one leading what the criteria is. You're the one choosing how best to set up the application process to support the events that would help your neighborhood or community recover.
Got it. Thank you.
And then, Jenny, so Chris
Mhm.
is asking about any chance the funds can be spent in December by the lead and be reimbursed.
You mean this December? Is that what you're
I think so.
asking?
This December.
So are you asking to see if there's any event, if there's potential for you to be able to do the support events starting in December? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
So the faster that if you have, I would say that it would be up to you how quickly you can mobilize as the lead organization to set up an application process to disperse those funds. If you already have systems in place and you are ready and roaring to go to create an application process and start submitting and supporting events, more power to you. We would love that. We just share the timeline that we shared was something. I think the original intention was to hopefully support events throughout the winter for this, but unfortunately there were some delays to it, so we weren't able to get it out. So we really wanted to not necessarily force I'm just going back to the timeline. We didn't want to force organizations to have to push these funds out to support events immediately. So you can see that lead organizations carry out the selection process for neighborhood arts and cultural events. If you're able to carry out that selection process even sooner in winter, you're welcome to. We probably won't be able to make the notification process until early November. But again, once you're contracted with us, if you're able to if you have all that stuff ready to go or if you already have a selection process and this money just kind of bolsters the work that you're already doing, if you already have a grant thing that you do or something similar that you do, and this funding is really just bolstering what you already do, and you're not necessarily waiting on this funding to create that system to get these funds out to your community, then if you can get them out sooner, all the better.
Okay, thanks.
I would make sure that you would just make that you'd probably want to have a contract, and you'll just know that you'll need to have a contract in place before we're able to so we couldn't reimburse for anything that happened prior to the contract date. So that will also kind of cause give us a little bit of an idea of when you can support or use those funds.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, Jenny, in the chat.
Well, thank you all for staying on. It was a little bit more information than we needed to squeeze in there. So if you, big round of applause for Elaine for doing her first webinar with our office. And thank you so much for all of your questions. Please feel free to reach out to Elaine if you are interested, even just sending her a quick email. If you have any other additional questions, she's great at responding, and she'll definitely support you with those.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Have a good rest of your Wednesday. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, Betty Jean.
Yeah, hi. I got here late and I apologize. I was actually working on the grant and lost track of time and then realized word.
That's okay. Okay, I don't know where you came